This one is about the Ukraine war, but in terms of how it is reshaping world politics. I believe it is doing that, and I believe it is doing that in a way pretty much the opposite of what most outlets in the West would have us believe. Let me explain. Much of the public discourse in the West, and by the West I mean the United States and Western Europe and a few other allies, but mostly the United States and Western Europe, and Eastern Europe too, for that matter. There is a story in which the Ukraine war is isolating Russia. In other words, there is a kind of notion that the globe as a whole, the world, is scolding or punishing or isolating Russia because Russia invaded Ukraine, etc. I want to argue that something very different is actually going on. And it is ironic, but the best way I can think of to describe what's going on is that the United States is being isolated. It is isolating itself by the positions it has taken. Let me show you how this works. Since the Russians invaded Ukraine, the United States has denounced that, often with words like unprovoked or uh, dictatorial or authoritarian, all the usual kinds of words for something you don't like and something that is bad. And it has called on the world to rally around this idea, and that Russia's the bad guy here, and we are all supposed to isolate the bad guy to punish the bad guy for the bad thing they did. Well, what has actually happened? The United States doesn't want to engage in a nuclear war with Russia. I assume that needs no explanation. The United States might have liked to have a land war, a non nuclear war with Russia, but that's a very risky bet. You can't control what the Russians do. So any kind of war with troops and guns and planes is kind of out of the question. Plus, it would put a strain on the alliance between the United States and Europe because Europe would be where that war was fought again, and they don't want that. And Ukraine is not an issue that they would want to fight that war about, in all likelihood, especially with the risk of nuclear war. So, what the United States came up with was a sanctions war, an economic war to isolate Russia and to crush, to destroy, to weaken, and all those words were used, Russia as a way to bring it to withdraw from Ukraine, more or less. This project of isolating Russia, weakening it economically with all the sanctions that were mostly geared to destroying the market for Russian oil and gas, has failed. I mean, there is lots of pretense around it. I'm an economist. I look at the numbers, didn't work. Why? It turns out that Russia had other places to sell its oil and gas: India, China, and pretty much the rest of the world. And so it found new markets to replace the old ones that were the object of the sanctions. The Russian ruble crashed a little bit right after the invasion, but has come back and is basically functioning like there was no war going on, pretty much maintaining for most of the time its normal pre-invasion values. Crushing Russia in terms of its exports didn't work. Crushing Russia in terms of the ruble, crushing Russia in terms of its overall economic performance, it didn't happen. It was supposed to happen quickly. It hasn't happened at all. But now I want to take this point as another step. What has happened has been a really profound speed up in what was already underway before the Russians invaded, but has really accelerated the process. And that is a coming together of Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and now another list of 10 or 20 more economies eager to join that first group called the BRICS. And they're doing things that are not isolating Russia. They're creating a whole new world currency, which already does, compete with the US dollar. For most of the last 75 years, the US dollar was the dominant currency in the world. No real competitor. Now it has a competitor. And who's behind it? A block of people in the world that are much, much larger, many times the size of Western Europe and the United States. And they are a powerful economic force as well, and a powerful political force. And with Russia and China included, a powerful nuclear force. A huge part of the world has looked at the Ukraine conflict and decided if they were before allies of the West, they are now worrying that they may have bet on the wrong horse, and they're quickly shifting over, joining the BRICS or applying to do so, agreeing to do their business not only in US dollars, but in Chinese yuan, or perhaps a new currency that comes out of this new alliance. Where the United States and Europe were on top, the colonial powers that ruled the world, as in the good old days of the British Empire, or in the more modern form of the American hegemony, that's what the Ukraine war has exposed as being no longer the case. That's why the Ukraine war is changing world politics. And there's no polite way to get around that it is a situation, excuse me, in which the old dominant power of Western Europe, all of Europe, and the United States is shrinking in its position, its power relative to the emerging alternative. This war has unified the rest of the world while shrinking the power. When I began this brief discussion and drove home that the plan of the West, led by the United States, to cripple the Russian economy as the strategy to solve the Ukraine war, that didn't work. And the whole world is watching what isn't working. Meanwhile, Russia and China's political, economic, cultural footprint gets bigger and bigger, and the whole world is adjusting. Denying this is not going to make it go away.